Thank you, and it's always a pleasure to be back here and drop the microphone. And that's right, native of Santa Rosa. I spent my first few years on this planet on Slater Street in Santa Rosa. It was good times. I just had to eat and sleep. It's always a pleasure to be back here, and what I want to do today is change a little bit the way in which I do the economic outlook and start by talking about Sonoma County. You've heard a number of the issues about rebuilding, and what I'd like to do is give you some backdrop, some historical experience of what has happened in other communities in rebuilding based on some research that I've done. The EDB and your local leaders have been moving rapidly, and you've kind of heard the challenges, and I want to echo that and show you some data on that. So the program for today is to talk about the soaring Sonoma County economy, and that's good news. That's great news, but it also presents some challenges in the rebuilding. And so talk about the economics of recovery, then turn to the U.S. outlook and a little bit about the tax bill and what it's going to do, the California outlook, and some risks, and return to a Sonoma County forecast. So let's begin with unemployment. And unemployment in Sonoma County, as you know, is extraordinarily low. The reports in the press said it's the lowest in about 16, 17 years. But if you look at this diagram, there are only a couple of months in the past 30 years when unemployment has been lower. And that just kind of dropped down and back up. So this is extraordinarily low unemployment, and instead of the unemployment line, it's looking to higher. And that's a critical issue as you all go forward in these next couple of years. There's also record employment levels. It's not, as in some places, low unemployment because there are people who are discouraged and out of the labor force. There's highest employment levels ever in Sonoma County. So that's good news. And that means that since the depth of the recession, 15% growth in employment. But when you get to these record employment levels and record low unemployment, there isn't a pool of idle labor to draw on. And so the latest numbers show you 0.9% increase in employment, a dramatic kind of slowing in the growth of employment. And if we just look around the state, so this is regional employment growth last 12 months. The green is Sonoma, the rust brown is the U.S. What's happening around the state is most areas of the state that have been lagging behind, they're the ones that are growing faster than the U.S. San Francisco and Silicon Valley still growing faster, but only at about half the rate that they were growing. And then Sonoma now with this very low unemployment growing much slower than the U.S. And again, that's because the resources are not here to grow faster. Now, why is San Francisco and Silicon Valley, also with low unemployment, able to grow a bit faster in their in employment? Because they're also high cost of living areas. Well, you can see that from here. This is the distribution of jobs in San Francisco, which is red, Silicon Valley in blue, and Sonoma in green. And just a very different constellation of jobs. In Sonoma, you have on the left, you have farming, non-durable goods manufacturing, which includes beverage production, and tourism and retail are more dominant. And over on the right, you've got San Francisco and Silicon Valley, where tech is more dominant. Tech tends to hire much higher income individuals who can afford more easily the higher cost of housing And that's why, even though the growth rate is slowing, and we expect it to slow much more, it's still higher than the US today. But there's a change coming as of January 1. There's a new industry that Sonoma County is uniquely positioned to take advantage of, and it's going to involve tourism as well as farming and non-durable goods manufacturing. So I found this picture. Tourism, marijuana tourism in Colorado is a big deal. And this is a van, and it says on it, Telluride Mary Jane Tours. And then what you can't read at the top is their tagline, the highest tour in Colorado. So that's coming here to California, maybe here to Sonoma. But this is an issue, and it's an issue that you've heard about many times. The price of housing in Sonoma County is now at record levels. It's above that which was experienced during the housing bubble, but it's not a housing bubble now. It's a housing shortage. And so that's a critical issue in increasing the labor force. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that as I go through this. So a little digression on some I'm going to show you 3 historical instances of recoveries, or the lack thereof, from natural disasters. The picture here is of the Oakland Hills 20 years later, after they suffered that devastating fire and tragedy, completely rebuilt. But as I think the mayor said correctly, this is 20 years later in Oakland Hills, and 20 years is really way too long. So just taking you through a couple of these. This is the big earthquake in Anchorage. It was a magnitude 9.2 in 1964. But some characteristics about the Anchorage economy. It's a small economy. It's an isolated economy. About half of the economy was dependent on military spending, which was completely unaffected by the earthquake. But then what happened? What you see here are 2 lines, a green line and a red line. The green line is what I projected would be income in Anchorage had the earthquake not occurred. And the red line, income, the actual income, what really happened. And if you look at the difference, Anchorage didn't recover. And they still haven't recovered. They didn't have the resources. They were isolated. They couldn't draw resources in. And so the economy shrunk, and it stayed that way. Now let's turn to another one. This is Japan. And this is the Great Hanshin earthquake. It was in Kobe, massively destructive because it was in a major city, an area of over 5 million people. And what happened there? They had rapid recovery. The red line is actually above the green line. It drops below, but it dropped below because of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, not because of anything that was actually happening in Kobe. What's the difference between those two? The difference was that after the Kobe earthquake, Japan mobilized resources. It brought in from outside construction workers to rebuild, and they rebuilt rapidly, and it added new capital stock. And so you get a full recovery in a short period of time. And that's really a key difference. So we'll take just a quick look at one more, which is Katrina. And because there's something instructive about Katrina here, we kind of all know the story about Katrina, but so let's look at what actually happened. The red line drops below the green line. Not much recovery. Actually, there's still not a recovery to today. But there's one point there where that red line comes up to the green line, and that is 2007. What's instructive here is that in 2007, the housing market was taking a very deep dive here in California, right? Construction was drying up, and construction workers were being laid off. And in particular, the first construction workers laid off were undocumented immigrants. They didn't have a safety net. So they looked around and said, okay, so where can we work? Oh, they need a lot of housing in in New Orleans, and you saw a massive outflow of undocumented construction workers from California to New Orleans. That's what's happening there. And then, of course, the 2008 recession, and that all ended. It's instructive, in the Hanjin earthquake is instructive because communities don't have standby resources to draw upon when they have unexpected disasters. And you have to bring in those resources from outside. And the housing issue that we just talked about, that's kind of critical of finding housing and mobilizing resources from outside the economy. So an economy that's doing very well, but this is a challenge that that is coming up in order to grow and to build on the resiliency that's here, but to grow and recover rapidly. Okay, so I just said that. And let's go on to the US. And so I've got two things here. One is just chaos in Washington, and there's a whole list, but I did this last week, and the list changes every day. But I kind of like this picture from the Atlantic where Uncle Sam is just kind of cowering in a corner saying, enough, I'm just exhausted. And then on the right-hand side is, this is the turtle sundae, supposed to be the world's largest sundae. You can buy it in Chicago. You can't eat all of it, but you can take bets on that. And that's about the sugar high that we're about to go on in the US economy. So let's just take a moment for GDP growth calculus. So what goes into GDP? One of the things is labor force. We've got a full employment economy, and we're trying to, through immigration policy, make sure that the labor force doesn't grow very fast. Changes in technology, productivity went down in the fourth quarter of last year. We've been in kind of a productivity slump, and the third part of getting the economy to grow is new capital stock. And that's what the tax bill is really all about. That's the way it was sold. Lower corporate taxes, get new capital stock, and grow the economy that way. But the tax bill is going to result in an increase in the deficit. And there's a debate about how much. We're fairly conservative in our estimates. And what you see here is that the deficit grows, then it kind of shrinks a little bit and then grows again. And the shrinking a little bit is because of taxes that are paid on repatriated funds from U.S. corporations that are being held abroad. But what that means is the federal government's going to have to borrow more. And in a tight economy with full employment and with inflation at 2% or above, the Federal Reserve will be normalizing interest rates. The Fed is also selling off some of its massive portfolio that it gained during the Great Recession. And so we're going to see interest rates go up. Now, you look at this and you say, well, the short rate is about 3%, the long rate is about 4%, the long rate is the top line, and that's pretty high. But if you have an inflation rate of 2%, these are still fairly low interest rates, but they're higher than today. And so the implication of that is that they are going to discourage some auto sales. Auto sales in January were down. They're also down because automobiles that were lost in the Gulf hurricanes have now been replaced, and so the demand is going down. So we have this increase in consumer purchases of a durable good that's now declining. Same thing is going to be happening with homes. So in the US, we're going to have increase in home building, but then it's going to start declining as we get into 2019 with higher interest rates, making homes more expensive. Equipment spending, and this is really one of the places where the new tax bill kind of bites here, and that is in equipment spending. So the idea is for the tax bill to increase investment, and that's exactly what we expected to do. And one of the provisions that I think is key here is expensing. So expensing says if you buy new equipment, you can take depreciation against your taxable income of 100% in the first year. And if you don't use all of that, you can carry it over. That's going to induce firms to invest today and to do investments today that they would have done in 2019 and 2020. And we used to have a provision called the investment tax credit that would always come on when a recession happened. And you would see as we got close to a recession, companies would stop investing because they wanted to get the investment tax credit. And that pullback of investment was part of the reason why we got those recessions. So now what we're doing is we're pulling back investment into 2018. Means this year is going to be a pretty good year. But that's investment that was going to occur in 2019 and 2020. So again, things are kind of being front-loaded here. And that's the sugar high. So we're going to get an increase in GDP. We're just about where consensus is amongst forecasters in kind of the mid-threes this quarter. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta thinks it's going to be higher than that. But then it really kind of tails off here because of all of those things that were pulled into 2018 that won't be there in 2019. We're not predicting a 2019 recession, but we're going to go under 2% growth. So we're kind of borrowing from the future unless we can continue to pump the economy with more sugar, but more likely it's going to be a sugar crash when we get to 2019. Sure, a lot of you have experienced this. But what that means is that unemployment is going to go below 4% this year, but then as the economy stops growing quite so fast, it'll go back above 4%. And it does mean that we're going to get good wage growth. In the latest numbers that came out this morning, 3% on an annualized basis wage growth in January. So good wage growth finally in the economy. So the U.S. outlook, we've got forecast risks, failure of NAFTA talks, China trade war, geopolitical events, and then we have some sectors that are out of balance. Retail is certainly one of them, and maybe there's some others. So these are kind of risks to keep our eye on, things that could cause the forecast to go awry. So now let's do a little Mythbusters. And the myth is that low taxes equal economic growth. And we hear this a lot. So let me just show you a slide here. So this would be the Mythbusters slide. This is state GDP performance for states with population greater than 5 million. This is the last 5 years. All the states there are in blue except for the Golden State, which is in gold. And you notice that it's number 2. And if you look across the states there, you have states like Minnesota and California that have high taxes and states like Texas that have low taxes. And if you just take the Tax Foundation's indicator of business-friendly states and do a correlation, what you would predict here is that the more business-unfriendly a state is, the faster it grows. Well, I mean, that correlation is a little bit spurious, but the point is there are many other things that influence economic growth than taxes, and we don't have any empirical evidence that taxes really spur economic growth. There are instances where they do, but mostly not so much. In California, so this is really business-unfriendly state, we have record employment. The top line is total employment, and it includes the self-employed and farm employment, and we're at 9% above our previous trough. For payroll employment, we're about 10% above. So we've been growing rapidly, and we continue to grow rapidly. In December, which is the last month that we have numbers for, we had very good job growth in the U.S. 1/3 of all those jobs were created in California. But the unemployment rate has been declining. We're now insignificantly different from the national unemployment rate because we've had that rapid job growth. And what's happened is where we were at over 40,000 jobs a month, we've now dropped in the last 2 years to about 30,000. And that's because in California, we're confronted with exactly what you're confronted with here in Sonoma, which is a constrained economy because there just aren't many people sitting on the sidelines waiting for labor markets to tighten and to become sufficiently good to enter the labor market. They are sufficiently good for everyone to enter the labor market who is looking for employment. And one way to measure that is to measure the employment to population ratio. This is of the working age population. When you see in the federal pronouncements about employment to population ratios, they include people above 64. They include people above 100 who probably are not looking for a job. So I stop it at 64. But if you just look at the trend in the employment to population ratio here in California, we're above that trend, and it keeps going up. Home building, you saw that home building in the U.S. was turning down in 2019. We don't have that in California because we have a constrained housing supply. We've got a robust demand for housing, and so we have it going up, but not going up by quite as much. Now, there have been some regulatory changes, just as you have regulatory changes here in Sonoma to spur housing. There are regulatory changes statewide, and it may, in fact, be going up faster than that. But we've got a pretty solid trend now that takes us back to about where we were in 1999 and 2000. So the forecast for California, we have employment growth that is slowing, but it slows to about 1.2%. That's still faster than the U.S. And we have unemployment rate dropping to 4.6%, may go under that in the coming year. We've got a new forecast coming out in December, and I'm expecting that forecast to show a lower unemployment rate, but not much lower. And then personal income growth, faster than the U.S. We produce high value-added products here in California, and that generates good income growth. And then housing starts getting up to 121,000. I think it'll probably go a bit higher than that. So now turning back to Sonoma County, our forecast for economic growth is at 2.8%. So you notice that's slower than the state, but that's because employment growth is also slower than the state. And if you kind of do the division on per capita income growth, actually Sonoma's per capita income growth will be higher than the state average. But again, the issue is the issue and the policy challenge, which you've heard earlier this morning, which EDB has been working diligently on, and you're going to hear a lot more about today, is how do you translate that resiliency that exists here in Sonoma into not just continued solid economic growth, but also recovery and creating that bright future. And that's part of that challenge, which I've tried to illustrate, is a constrained labor force and obtaining resources to actually make this happen. But nevertheless, I think the outlook is clearly very bright for Sonoma going forward. Thank you.